Uday and Qusay, Saddam Hussein's two sons. However, now U.S. officials tell us they are, quote, highly optimistic that in fact they have succeeded in killing these two men.
On the morning of July 22, 2003, the streets around a villa in Mosul began to fill with American soldiers, Humvees, and the low movement of a raid that had been building for months, until one house in northern Iraq became the center of a hunt that had followed rumors, informants, safe houses, and the wreckage of Saddam Hussein's fallen regime. Inside were two of the most wanted men in the country, Uday Hussein, the oldest son of Saddam, and his younger brother Qusay, the man many believe Saddam trusted more, were hiding behind the walls of a private home while loudspeakers outside ordered them to surrender. For a moment, there was only the strange quiet that comes before a house becomes a battlefield. Then the answer came from the upper floor. Gunfire tore through the stairwell. American soldiers were wounded, and the son who had spent most of his life protected by palaces, bodyguards, fear, and his father's name was suddenly fighting from one trapped building with no army coming to save him. The same Iraq that had once lowered its voice when Uday's name was mentioned had changed around him. Baghdad had fallen, Saddam was missing. The old portraits were being pulled down, and the man who had acted for years as if consequences belonged to everyone else was surrounded in Mosul, waiting for the walls to break. Uday Hussein grew up while his father's name was becoming heavier across Iraq, inside a family where power did not feel distant or official, but close enough to decide how people stood, how they spoke, and how quickly a room could turn dangerous. Saddam was building his place inside the Ba'ath Party through loyalty, force, and calculation. And Uday grew up near the machinery of a state where fear was not an accident of rule, but one of its tools. The people around him did not treat him like an ordinary child. They treated him like the son of a man, rising toward absolute power. And when a child grows up, surrounded by guards, servants, whispers, and adults who understand that offending him could reach his father, the world begins to look different from the top. By the time Saddam became the center of Iraq's political life, Uday had already learned that his family name could open doors, silence people, and make ordinary consequences disappear. He rode in cars other people could only stare at, moved with protection around him, and lived in a country where government, family, party, and violence were all tangled together. Accounts from people who later spoke about his youth describe a boy who was indulged at home and hardened by the world around his father, a son exposed early to the rituals of dictatorship and to the belief that fear could be inherited like property. Saddam seemed to want a hard son, one who could survive in the Iraq he had built, but the hardness that formed around Uday did not turn into discipline. It turned into appetite. He learned that other people could be made small for his amusement, that anger could be acted on before anyone dared to stop him, and that the family name could turn even serious crimes into family problems instead of public justice. As he grew older, Baghdad saw more of that appetite. Cars, parties, women, athletes, officials, and servants all moved through the same dangerous space, because Uday was not simply rich or spoiled. He was close to the ruler, and in Saddam's Iraq, that meant people had to calculate every answer they gave him. Saddam tried to give his oldest son a place that looked respectable. In 1984, Uday was placed over the Iraqi Olympic Committee and Iraq's football world, positions that should have made him a guardian of national pride in a country where sport offered one of the few public joys left under war and dictatorship. Football mattered to Iraqis. Athletes represented more than games. They carried the country's name into stadiums, tournaments, and television screens. And for a young man trying to prove he could lead, sport should have been an easy stage. Uday turned that stage into another room of fear. Former athletes later described what happened when losing a match no longer meant disappointment, but punishment. Players who failed him said they were detained, beaten, humiliated, and dragged into places where the language of discipline covered the reality of abuse. Training grounds and Olympic buildings became attached to stories that spread in whispers during Saddam's rule and came into the open after the regime fell. A missed shot, a bad game, a lost tournament, or a performance Uday found embarrassing could follow a man out of the stadium and into a cell. The athletes were supposed to carry Iraq's pride, but under Uday, they also carried the fear of what waited if that pride was wounded. That was how Uday's power moved. It did not stay in one office or one title. It slipped into sports, newspapers, television, radio, militias, parties, family rivalries, and the streets of Baghdad. He did not have to control the whole state to make people afraid. He only needed enough guards, enough access, enough money, and enough protection from his father to make refusal dangerous. The country already knew what Saddam's system could do to enemies. Uday made that system feel personal, unpredictable, and close. Even inside the family, his violence created problems Saddam could not always hide. In 1988, during a party attended by important guests, Uday attacked Kamel Hana Gegeo, Saddam's trusted valet and a man connected to one of the most painful private insults inside Saddam's household. Kamel had helped introduce Saddam to Samira Shahbandar, the woman who became Saddam's second wife, and Uday saw the relationship as a humiliation to his mother and a threat to his own place in the family. The party should have been a controlled display of power and wealth. Instead, it became one of the moments when Uday's rage spilled into the open. Kamel was beaten and later died, and the shock reached even people used to cruelty at the center of Iraq. Saddam was furious, but fury from a dictator was not the same as justice when the guilty man was his son. Uday was punished, his privileges were attacked, and he was sent away for a time. But the door back to Iraq remained open. A man outside the family could have vanished for less. Uday returned. People watching from inside the regime could read the lesson clearly. Saddam might burn his cars, send him abroad, or push him aside for a while, but Uday was still protected by blood. The problem for Uday was that Saddam knew the difference between fear and reliability. His oldest son could frighten people, build attention, and act like an heir, but he was too wild to trust with the deepest parts of the regime. Qusay, the younger brother, moved differently. He was quieter, steadier, and more useful to Saddam's security state. While Uday collected public roles, money, media, and spectacle, Qusay was pulled closer to the machinery that truly mattered: elite military units, intelligence networks, and the organs that kept the regime alive. Uday still carried the louder name in public, but inside Saddam's house, the future was slipping toward the younger son. Uday felt it. He had grown up expecting inheritance, and now he watched his brother receive the trust he wanted. So he built another kind of power. After the Gulf War, with Iraq wounded by defeat and sanctions, Uday expanded his media empire through newspapers, magazines, television, and radio. He understood that propaganda did not always have to look stiff. His outlets could play Western music, show films, criticize selected officials, and appear more open than the old state channels, while still carrying the message that Saddam was the center of the nation, and that blame belonged to traitors, enemies, corrupt ministers, or whoever Uday chose to turn into a target. For young Iraqis, some of Uday's media felt different because it offered entertainment in a closed country, but the freedom was never real. The same man who gave people music and movies also enforced the rules of a dictatorship. Journalists who disappointed him, critics who stepped too far, and people who failed to praise the right way entered the same shadow that followed athletes. Former insiders later described torture rooms, threats, disappearances, and punishments tied to his offices and compounds. The songs on the radio did not soften the system. They helped make the cage feel more polished. Uday wanted force too. In the 1990s, he became tied to Fedayeen Saddam, a militia that drew in young men and wrapped violence in the language of loyalty. They were not the regular army, and that was part of their usefulness. They could move through streets, intimidate enemies, enforce obedience, and serve the regime in ways that felt more personal and more frightening. For Uday, the militia gave him something he envied in Qusay's world: armed men who looked like they belonged to him. Saddam saw the danger. A son with media outlets, money, armed followers, and a hunger for recognition could become more than an embarrassment. He could become a rival inside the palace, especially in a regime where family loyalty and political survival were always pressed together. Uday insisted he served his father, but his boasting and his behavior made even Saddam uneasy. Slowly, power was pulled away from him. Qusay gained more control. Loyalists were shifted. Uday's circle was watched and cut down without giving him a clean moment to rebel. Then, in December 1996, Baghdad saw that Uday could bleed. He was driving through the Mansour district in a red Porsche when gunmen opened fire with Kalashnikovs. Bullets tore into the car and into his body. He survived, but the attack left him badly wounded and partly paralyzed, with pain and injuries that followed him for the rest of his life. For a country that feared saying his name too loudly, the news moved like smoke through closed rooms. Someone had reached him. Someone had fired into the life that seemed protected from every side. The shooting did not make him softer. If anything, the years after the attack made him more bitter and more unstable, while his real political future kept shrinking. Saddam used the moment to give Qusay more authority, and Uday was left with the wealth, the name, the cruelty, and the public reputation, but less of the trust that could have made him ruler after his father. He still had houses, guards, cars, contacts, and the ability to terrify people, yet his place in the family had changed. He was dangerous, but no longer the chosen future. Outside the palaces, Iraq was also changing. Sanctions had made ordinary life harder. The regime was still feared, but it was no longer wrapped in the same confidence. Saddam's wars had left the country isolated, watched, and weakened. Uday continued living far above the people his family ruled, surrounded by wealth, in a country where many families were struggling for basic things, and that distance made the stories around him even darker. He had everything Iraq could give him, and still seemed to want more from the people trapped beneath him. Then came March 2003. American forces crossed into Iraq, and the state that had protected Uday for his entire life began to crack in weeks. The invasion moved faster than the regime could absorb. Iraqi units were hit from the air, pushed from the ground, or melted away. Baghdad fell in April. The statues and portraits came down. Palaces were entered by foreign soldiers. Offices were abandoned. Men who had spent years surrounded by guards and ritual suddenly became fugitives inside their own country. For Uday, the fall of Baghdad turned his life upside down with brutal speed. The cars, media outlets, sports offices, militia ties, and family connections that had made him untouchable could not stop the collapse of the government that held all of it together. Saddam disappeared. Qusay disappeared. Uday disappeared with them. The man who once moved through Iraq as if the country belonged to his family now had to hide among the same people his family had ruled by fear. The Americans placed a bounty on Saddam's sons. Their faces appeared on wanted lists. Raids moved through houses, mosques, farms, and suspected safe locations. Informants were questioned. Rumors spread that they had crossed into Syria, that they were moving through tribal networks, that loyalists were protecting them, that they were still inside Iraq, waiting for the right moment to reappear. For weeks, Uday lived in the strange silence of a man used to attention but forced into hiding, a man whose old life had been built on being seen and feared, now surviving by disappearing. In Mosul, the brothers found shelter in the villa of Nawaf al-Zaidan, a man tied to the old order and living in a city where many still resented the American presence. Protecting Saddam's sons was dangerous, but betraying them was dangerous too. The reward offered by the Americans was enormous, the kind of money that could change a family forever, but the old fear of the Hussein name did not vanish just because the regime had fallen. Anyone who turned them in had to wonder who might come looking later. On July 21st, Nawaf made his choice and went to the Americans. They questioned him, tested his story, and moved quickly because a chance like that might not come again. By the next morning, troops were around the villa. Special operations soldiers and infantry sealed the area, called for surrender, and prepared for a fight while civilians nearby watched another piece of Saddam's Iraq cornered inside a private home. The first attempt to enter the house met gunfire from above. Uday, Qusay, and the men with them fired down from the second floor, wounding American soldiers and forcing the assault team back. More troops arrived. The cordon grew, the quiet street became a war zone. Rifle fire hammered the building. Heavy weapons were brought in. Helicopters circled overhead and fired into the villa while the walls began to break apart. Inside, the brothers kept refusing to surrender. The fight lasted for hours, and with every hour, the house lost more of the protection it had given them. Windows shattered, walls cracked, smoke and dust moved through the rooms. The men inside threw grenades and fired back, while the Americans tightened around the building. Apache helicopters were considered, then held back over concern for civilians nearby, but the pressure continued, with rifles, rockets, and the slow destruction of the place that had become their final refuge. For Uday, the scene was the reverse of his whole life. No crowd was being forced to cheer for him. No athlete was trapped in one of his rooms. No reporter had to guess whether one sentence could ruin his life. No official could step in and make the problem disappear. The guards, palaces, convoys, and fear that had surrounded him for decades were gone. There was only a house in Mosul, soldiers outside, and the sound of the walls coming apart. When the villa finally went quiet, American soldiers entered carefully through the damaged rooms. Uday and Qusay were dead. Qusay's young son Mustafa was also killed after reportedly firing on the soldiers during the search. The bodies were taken to Baghdad for identification, badly damaged enough that many Iraqis did not believe the first reports. After years under Saddam, people had learned not to trust announcements about the fate of powerful men. DNA and dental records were used to confirm the deaths, and once the news settled, Iraq reacted in different voices. Some mourned the sons of the old regime, many others celebrated, firing weapons into the air or speaking with a relief they could not have shown while the family ruled. After the raid, the world Uday left behind became easier to see. Houses, cars, documents, photographs, and testimony from former athletes, journalists, and insiders helped show how far his life had separated from the Iraq around him. While ordinary people had endured war, sanctions, fear, shortages, and surveillance, Uday had lived with luxury and cruelty side by side. The stories that had once moved quietly through Baghdad could now be told in the open, and the man who had used fear to make himself untouchable was no longer alive to punish the people speaking. Uday Hussein's story is not only the story of a violent son inside a violent family, it is the story of what dictatorship can create when a ruler's child grows up surrounded by power without restraint, protected from ordinary law, and taught that fear is a language everyone understands. Saddam's Iraq gave Uday the shield. His own cruelty gave him the reputation. Sports, media, militias, money, and family loyalty gave him reach. For years, that was enough to make people step aside. But protection can disappear faster than the people inside it believe. In 2003, the state that had carried Uday collapsed around him, and the son who had once lived above Iraq ended his life hiding inside one house in Mosul. He had spent decades acting as if consequences were meant for athletes, servants, rivals, women, reporters, and ordinary families. But when the regime fell, there was no throne waiting for him, no country bending around his name, and no future as Saddam's heir. There was only the villa, the soldiers outside, and the final silence after the guns stopped. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe for more history content covering wars, revolutions, and events that shaped the modern world.